Well, hello again. It's good to be with you. Today we're going to be looking at Lesson 3 in our unit on the Anxious Christian. Just by way of a little bit of review, if you remember, as far as a course objective, the purpose of our course is to provide a Christian perspective on the physical, psychological, and spiritual dimensions of anxiety, and offer some practical steps and also some biblical insights on how God can transform our suffering into a new way of thinking and living characterized by inner peace and outward joy. If you recall our outline for the course, first week we had an introduction. The second week I went over some ways to help people that are suffering with anxiety, looking at both some practical and biblical insights. This week we're going to be looking at the biology of anxiety. So by virtue of that, this talk will be a little more technical. And we'll also talk a little bit about how medications work based on the results of the survey that I gave out the first week. I know there's some people that are either on medications for anxiety or they have loved ones, children, and so on medications. So I thought it'd be helpful at least touch a little bit about some of the mechanics of those medications so you can kind of be prepared and better equipped to minister to people that may be taking those types of medications. Then we're going to be looking at the psychology of anxiety in week 4. We'll look at some different concepts there. Also, weeks 5 and 6, we'll be looking at some specific strategies for how to manage anxiety, both through adjustments we can make in our lives and also introducing the concept of acceptance or trusting, how we can learn to trust God in the midst of difficulties and suffering. So I've got this quote I had on week 1 from Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, who talked about the fact that anxiety is really somewhat complex. It involves several different factors, both physical, psychological, and spiritual. And it's important when we're looking at the issue not to assume that the issue is like purely spiritual. There can be physical and some other issues related to anxiety. So it's important to kind of understand all of those if we're going to be effective into ministering to folks. So as far as this talk today, we're going to be looking at how does our body respond to stress? What is the relationship between our GI system and mental health? Most people are not aware of that connection. We'll also look at the role of hormones, how they can play a role in mental health and anxiety. Also talk about something called neurotransmitters, which are chemicals in the brain. I think at this stage, most people have kind of heard of that term before. You're bombarded with ads for different medications and so on the TV. So we'll talk a little bit about what they are and how they might affect anxiety. And then finally talk a little bit about how medications for anxiety work so you're a little better equipped to understand what's going on if you're taking them or you have a child or a loved one that's about to embark on that path. So the Bible has a lot to say about the relationship between our spiritual health and our mental health. Here's just a few passages that kind of relate to that. We're told that we are very complex, wondrous creatures that God has made. And that's certainly reflected in the amazing parts of our biology, not only the complexity, but the comprehensive nature of that. So we're going to look a little bit about some of those components today, and also talk about the fact that sometimes it may be necessary or beneficial to augment an anxiety crisis with some medications. Certainly in the Bible, Paul admonishes Timothy, for example, to add some wine to his diet to try to improve his physical health or address some physical ailments. And then we can I think, extrapolate that same principle to the issue of medications with regard to anxiety, as we'll see here in a second. So first, let me give you a little bit of overview of the relationship between anxiety and our physiology. And we're going to start with the human brain, which is quite frankly probably the most complicated, amazing thing in the universe, other than obviously God himself. But if we look at the human brain, we can basically divide the brain into 3 different parts. We have sort of what's called the prefrontal cortex, which is shown here in this green box. That's really the thinking part of our brain. That's where we ruminate on thoughts, and formulate choices and decisions and so on. We then have sort of the counterpart to that, the emotional brain, which is highlighted with this red box, and technically that's characterized as the subcortical structures of the brain. We'll look a little bit about that. And then there's a third part of the brain that we'll be looking at later on during the class, the anterior cingulate cortex, which is really the assessing part of the brain. So when we start looking at the whole concept of Christian mindfulness in a couple of weeks, we'll see the importance of that part of the brain. So really we're going to look at how these three different parts of the brain interact with each other. When it comes to anxiety, the main focus we're going to start with is looking at the emotional brain, because that's where our actual feelings of anxiety are stimulated. But looking at the other two parts briefly, we have the reasoning part of the brain. It's actually has multiple components to that, so you almost might think of this as a very sophisticated computer with subcomputers that are all running in parallel nature together. I mentioned the anterior cingulate cortex. That's sort of the yellow part of this middle part of our brain that's shown here. And again, that governs our ability to make assessments and so on, as we'll see. And then finally, the emotional part of our brain actually can be subdivided in a lot of different components. And I'll try to walk you through these momentarily. So first we have something called the thalamus. It's sort of a relay station in your brain that connects your external stimuli and so on, your sight, your hearing, to the central part of your brain. We then have something called the hippocampus, where memories are kind of initiated and some of those are stored. We then have a third part called the amygdala, which is sort of like the fear alarm of the brain. So anytime we have a panic attack or we jump back in a stressful situation, for example, if you see a snake or something, your amygdala is being stimulated and kicking in and basically bypassing your thinking part of your brain. It reacts automatically, as we'll see. And so that is a significant component when we talk about anxiety. A third component is something called the hypothalamus, which tries to maintain equilibrium in our body. And the way it does that is by triggering the release of different chemicals in our bloodstream, or in stimulating one of two different sort of parts of our central nervous system, something called the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Then we have the pituitary that most people have probably heard before. The pituitary can control the release of other hormones from adrenal glands and so on. And then finally we have something called the basal ganglia, which basically coordinates automatic responses to stressful situations. And then finally something called the nucleus accumbens, which is sort of the reward center. So if I have an anxious situation, I resolve that anxiety, I typically feel a sense of relief that I've accomplished something that could be stimulating this seventh part of the brain. So let me talk a little bit about how our brains respond to acute or short-term stress. I'm sure if you're driving down I-64, I-75, and you look in your rearview mirror and you see blue lights flashing, what's the normal response of most people? Okay, you don't even think about it. You typically instantly, if you're like me, put my foot on the brake. Even if I'm driving the speed limit, there's just sort of this automatic response we have. And what's happening there is your brain is reacting automatically, bypassing your thinking part of your brain and responding to that anxiety. And that can happen with all kinds of different anxieties. So referring back to those different components of the sort of the emotional brain that I briefly introduced, let me try to walk you through sort of this cascade of events. It's almost like a series of dominoes that get knocked over when we encounter an acute stress. The first thing that happens is we have stimuli coming in from our vision, our hearing, or whatever, that goes through the thalamus. It then passes through the hippocampus that might stimulate some prior memories we've had about a stressful situation. Together, then those will activate the amygdala, which creates this feeling of fear. The way that it does that is it then triggers the hypothalamus to do three things. One, it starts the sympathetic nervous system, which then starts dumping some hormones into your bloodstream. There has all kinds of physical reactions that respond to that. It also activates the basal ganglia. So if you've ever encountered something like a snake coming across the path and you immediately, instantly jump back, you don't think about moving your body back. Your body does that automatically. It's your basal ganglia in the emotional part of your brain that's automatically sending that signal and doing that for you. Because in most cases, if you have a fear situation, you don't have time to think about how to react. Your body's automatically been programmed by God to react in a protective sense. And then a third thing that happens is the hypothalamus also signals the pituitary to dump some additional hormones in your system by triggering the adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys. These dump hormones like adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol into your bloodstream. And then also the hypothalamus can activate your brainstem and activate the nerve system that you have in your intestines, and you can start to sense that in your gut. So anybody have an anxious situation, you start feeling that in your gut, you start getting nauseous or tightness in your intestines. That's a response physiologically from your brain that's sending a signal to try to activate and shut things down in case there's a trauma that you've got to deal with. So that's kind of the steps that you go through when you're exposed to an acute stress. After that gets resolved, for example, if you've seen these blue lights in your rearview mirror, you get stressed, you might put your foot on the brake and the state trooper zips on down the highway. You typically then have a sort of a sense of relief. What happens there is your brain is actually activating that sense. What it does is it activates through another nerve system, the vagus nerve, the parasympathetic nervous system, which counteracts this stress response that you've seen. It dumps another hormone into your body that kind of counteracts the effects of the others, and you calm down and you kind of go back to normal. So these two different sort of automatic systems that you have in your body, one is, again, is the sympathetic system. This is activated in stress. Then when the stress passes, your parasympathetic nervous system then is activated and returns everything back to normal. Okay. Now, that's how we're designed by God to kind of respond to stressful situations. In our culture today, though, we're not typically, as we go about our business, worried about being attacked from some foreign entity or encountering a lion as we're going down the path and so on. But what we have done is, because through our society of just overlaying ourselves with stress, we tend to continually activate this stress system, and if that just continues over and over again, this can start to lead to chronic anxiety issues, okay? So what happens is chronic stress sets up this feedback loop between our thinking part of our brain and the emotional part of our brain, and we just start bouncing back and forth between the two. We start thinking anxious thoughts. That activates our emotional brain. Our emotional brain sends out hormones and things that trigger sensations in our body. We feel those sensations. We start thinking about those sensations. That makes us more anxious. And we kind of get up on this loop that we're going around and around. Over time, because we're constantly activating this stress system, we can start to deplete some of the important hormones in our system. One of those in particular would be cortisol. And if we start to deplete the amount of cortisol we have in our body, then we can start experiencing chronic inflammation problems. Chronic inflammation problems can affect the health of our GI system, which we'll see in a second, is also related to our nervous system. So we can start to create a bunch of other problems. One thing that also can happen is you can start to deplete your sugar levels through constant stress like that. And many times when you wake up in the morning, your body is supposed to activate additional cortisol to kind of help wake you up, or and if your blood sugar is low and your cortisol levels are dropping below normal, your body kind of uses a backup strategy and dumps adrenaline in your system to try to get you to wake up from sleep or whatever. That's why a lot of people with sort of chronic anxiety problems start to experience sort of morning anxiety when every time they wake up, they're feeling anxious, all right? That's typically reflective of the fact that you have overstressed your normal system and you've depleted some of the basic chemicals in your body that provides balance for that. So I kind of mentioned the issue of anxiety in the GI system. Most people never stop to think that there's a relationship between those two, but there is. Actually, there's a very complicated nervous system that's interfaced with our intestines, our stomach, and so on. And generically, or together, it's called the enteric nervous system. In fact, it's also sometimes frequently called the second brain because it contains 500 million neurons. 50% of the dopamine in your body is actually produced in your gut, and 90% of the serotonin is. So a lot of these neurochemicals are actually produced in our gut, not actually in our brain. So I'm sure people have experienced what you might call butterflies in your stomach and so on before. What's happening there is your brain, your gut is actually responding to stress and manifesting that self in certain sensations that you're having, okay? Now, remember I talked about if you have excessive chronic stress, it can start causing inflammation to occur. Another problem a lot of people have in today's society, we take a lot of excessive antibiotics for all kinds of things. And antibiotics, in addition to killing bad bacteria, can also kill good bacteria that line the linings of your intestine and protect the integrity of your gut. And when that happens, you can start to get your intestines start to develop gaps that allow food particles into your bloodstream that can start causing various types of additional inflammation or reactions to that, and immune abnormalities, food tolerances, and so on. And this also can have a triggering effect that can actually lead to additional sensations and feelings of anxiety. So it turns out maintaining the proper gut health is very important to your mental health. Most people don't think about that. One of the ways to kind of help support your good gut health is by taking some helpful probiotics. Here's a list of some of the different species that are out there, and there's been various types of research done in the scientific community that have documented different benefits to some of these, okay? So again, just to reiterate what I've said earlier, I am not a medical doctor, I'm not a mental health professional, I'm not a nutritionist, so anything I say with regard to information with regard to your body and your health, you should always consult your physician or a professional before changing anything in your diet, and that includes, for example, taking any kind of probiotic. But for most people, the science has shown that maintaining good health can also help improve your mental health. So talking about inflation is really one of the biggest causes of most diseases that we have, including heart disease. And so it also can affect your mental health in a negative way. So it's good to try to minimize the inflammation that you have in your body. It turns out we consume a lot of foods that actually contribute to inflammation. And one of the biggest ones is sugar. So I've got a list of some of the types of foods that can trigger inflammation. Is also some types of foods that have been shown in most people to be able to decrease inflammation. So if you're really having a problem with anxiety and it's physiologically related, it's always important to get a physical, talk to your doctor, and maybe consider changing some of your diet in consultation with that professional. Some additional causes of anxiety are a couple other neurotransmitters or hormones that occur in the body. One of those is glutamate. and that is a chemical that's found in a lot of different foods. So sometimes people that are consuming excessive amounts of these foods that I've listed here can sometimes have anxiety issues without knowing what's causing it. It may be the foods that you're eating. Another thing that can cause anxiety is high levels of histamines in your body. Some people are particularly sensitive to this. And again, here are some of the different types of foods that tend to have higher values of histamine. So these can also contribute to feelings of anxiety. Again, as I've mentioned through these and as I go through this discussion today, never modify your diet without consulting your family doctor. With that said, there's also sometimes just vitamins that people take can actually trigger anxiety. I think in our culture today, we all talk about the importance of vitamins, and people take supplemental vitamins. A lot of times the amount of vitamins in a lot of these over-the-counter products are really excessively higher than you need, and in many cases, if you take extremely high levels, they can actually trigger anxiety in a lot of people. A couple of things in particular: copper can trigger anxiety in some people, so look at your vitamins and see if they have high levels of copper. That can sometimes contribute to anxiety. The B vitamins can typically help people. People dealing with depression, a lot of cases they have B vitamin deficiencies. But if you take too much or too high levels of B vitamins, B6 and B12 as an example, B6 and more particularly, that can actually also trigger some feelings of anxiety in people. Conversely, there's a couple of minerals that have typically been found that can help contribute to a decreased anxiety. One of those is magnesium, which can reduce glutamate and cortisol levels. And typically, there's a lot of different types of magnesium out there. The one that's probably most beneficial is a form called magnesium glycinate. Another mineral that can be helpful is zinc, having proper levels of zinc that can help reduce copper. So a lot of times, someone that's dealing with anxiety that's physiologically driven, it's good to check your magnesium levels and your zinc levels. A lot of times people have deficiencies in those that are being manifest through anxiety symptoms. So the bottom line is some vitamins and supplements can actually contribute to anxiety. So if you started some new supplement or something and you start developing some anxiety symptoms, you might want to stop and think, well, maybe it's something that I've added to my diet or something. So that's something to consider. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the stress response system, the way that occurs. We've alluded to a couple of chemicals like hormones and neurotransmitters. So let me talk a little more about detail about both of those. The first of those is the relationship between anxiety and hormones. I think most people are aware that some people can have some hormone problems that can contribute to anxiety. Maybe the most widely known one is people that have thyroid issues. If those values become too high or low, they can contribute to some mental health issues. Here's a list of some typical hormones: cortisol, adrenaline, T3 and T4 that are related to your thyroid, insulin, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And you can see typically for most people, if these get too high or low, you can then start experiencing feelings of anxiety. So again, a lot of times anxiety sensations are being driven by physical issues. So how do these levels kind of get out of whack? Well, part of it can be related to your diet. Part of it can be related to the way that these hormones are actually produced in your body. So this is a little technical, but let me try to kind of walk you through this. So any hormone in your body is actually sort of manufactured on the fly as it's needed. And the way that happens is your body will generate or build enzymes, and these enzymes will then use vitamins, minerals, and a small molecule called a methyl G molecule, and then they take nutrients that you eat and break those down, rearrange those, and build these hormones, okay? Now, to build an enzyme, there has to be some instructions, and those instructions come from the DNA in the cells of the organs that produce these different hormones. And the DNA has instructions on how to basically build or arrange an enzyme. And the way that this happens in the cell, this instruction goes out in the cell. There's a little sort of if you want to think of it, sort of a manufacturing plant inside the cell. There's lots of these called ribosomes, and they take amino acids from the food that we've eaten, and they assemble these amino acids into enzymes. So after the hormones are built, they don't just hang around in your body. Your body then recycles these, so there are other enzymes that will take the hormones and break them down into subcomponents. Once again, you have an enzyme that's doing that. That enzyme also relies on the presence of certain vitamins, minerals, and methyl G values, and so on. So it's an amazing, very complicated process that God has designed in our bodies to build these hormones. And there's a lot of possible things now in a fallen world where things can start to break down. So you can have organ damage in the organ that's producing the hormones. The organ itself may be dysfunctional. We've alluded to already the thyroid, for example. You can have organ disease. If you're not eating enough proper nutrition, you can't build enough hormones because it needs the nutrients to build the hormones. If you have vitamin or mineral deficiencies, the enzyme won't work properly, so it can't produce the hormone that way. And as we'll see, there's actually some chemicals in the environment now in commercial products and so on that can actually block the production of hormones, or they can mimic hormones in either a positive or a negative way. And then in order to build the enzyme, remember, we said you have to have instructions in your cell, in your DNA. So if you have genetic deficiencies where your genetics don't properly give the right instructions for an enzyme, that can also help that produce a problem. So the bottom line is this is a very complicated process, and there are physical reasons why people can experience hormone deficiencies that can lead to then feelings of anxiety. I also then mentioned the whole concept of endocrine disruptors. There's a lot of environmental chemicals out there in the environment today, in our food, in health products, and so on, that have molecules or chemicals in them that can basically mimic or actually block the efficient production of hormones. So these are some other issues that can cause problems with people's hormones. So I've talked briefly about hormones. We've seen that if hormones can get out of whack, those can manifest themselves in sensations of anxiety that can then trigger the amygdala and so on in the emotional part of the brain. The second thing I want to talk about are another group of chemicals that can also manifest themselves in feelings of anxiety. And those are something called neurotransmitters. All right? So let me talk briefly about how your brain works and how it communicates and the importance of these special types of chemicals. So here is a little picture of a human brain or nerve cell. You see on the left-hand side over here, we have the cell and its nucleus. It's got these little arms that come out that connect to other nerves. Then it's got sort of a tail that has another part at the end with multiple branches there as well that are also connected to other nerves. So there's this huge network of nerves in our brain, and there's signals that are being passed through the nerves to communicate between one nerve and the other. Now, what's fascinating is when you look at these connections, you might think if I'm wiring an electrical network, I would like wire these little connections together. That's not the way that these nerves actually work. There's actually a gap or a space between one of these arms and the downstream arm, okay? If we were to blow that gap up, it looks something like this. Now, this is an incredibly complicated picture, but it underscores just the complexity of how God has made and crafted our brains, that these nerves have this amazing, like I said, complicated process where they communicate between each other. Now, that's much more complicated to cover here, so I'm going to try to use sort of a cartoon version of that to try to simplify things, all right? So let me try to do this. So on this left-hand side is the upstream nerve. This is this gap between the two nerves, and this is then the downstream nerve, okay? So the way that a nerve communicates is we have a signal coming from the upstream. It triggers the cell here to generate or build some little enzymes that it dumps into a little sac to store these, and then it moves over to this boundary and then dumps these little molecules into the gap. And those molecules are what we call neurotransmitters. They're called neurotransmitters because they're transmitting a signal from the upstream nerve to the downstream nerve. Now, these little molecules then come and fit into these little sort of doors on the downstream side, and these doors are called receptors. And so if one of these little molecules fits in, it's almost like a key, goes into the door opens, and it lets these other molecules or ions of sodium flow into this downstream cell here. Once you get enough of these sodium ions inside here, that then activates another big gate which sends a signal downstream to the next neuron in the path, okay? Once these little neurotransmitters are dumped in here and open the gate to let these ions in, they then pull out, and then they're recycled for use again by another gate called a transporter, okay? Now, isn't that amazing? This is just, I think it's unbelievably amazing how God designed all this, okay? Now, it turns out there's all kinds of different kinds of these little blue molecules or neurotransmitters, and we've got a picture of those over here, or a list of them over here on the right. You have what are called androgenetic, which include neoephrine and ephrin. We have serotonin that you may have heard about, dopamine, GABA, glutamate, and histamine, okay? And then this is highly simplified from what it's really like. There's actually all kinds of these doors, even for the same type of neurotransmitter. So for example, for serotonin, there's actually 13 different types of doors that a serotonin neurotransmitter can open. So it's incredibly complicated. And so here's a little picture of what one of these little gates look like, or one of these receptor gates. This would be like a closed receptor. You have the neurotransmitter comes in. It's like a key that goes in here. It then opens this gate, which is itself a molecule or a protein, and it opens and lets these neurotransmitter, or in this case, the sodium ions into the cell. All right. So you have a signal coming from up here. This cell gets activated. It dumps neurotransmitters into this gap between the two cells. The neurotransmitters open doors that let these ions in. You get enough of these, that activates a downstream signal, and it goes on downstream, okay? So this just summarizes a little more details about that. Transporters and receptors are just physical structures in the cell that are made up of proteins. They also get produced by these enzymes, okay? So if you have problems with those enzymes, you can have too few or too much of these transporters and receptors, which also can cause some issue. So for example, you have too many transporters, you can decrease the levels of neurotransmitters in the gap. You have too few, you can decrease the effectiveness of those in the gaps. And also certain vitamins, minerals, and chemicals can impact the production of these. So this highlights another area where someone may be struggling physiologically with anxiety. Has nothing to do with their spiritual condition or relationships. It has to do with the way their body is operating. Now, I mentioned a few of those neurotransmitters. Here's a list of 8 of the more common ones. It also shows a picture of what the actual molecule for each of those looks like. And so that's in your notes that you can look at. Just like hormones, researchers have found in general, if these values are too high in your bloodstream or in your brain, they can trigger feelings of anxiety. For example, if your adrenaline is really too high, you're going to feel anxious. Okay. Generally, if your glutamate values are too high or histamine values are too high, that can also trigger sensations of anxiety. We've already kind of talked briefly about that. And there's another important neurotransmitter that relates to anxiety, and that's something called the GABA neurotransmitter. This is the one that kind of regulates anxiety. So glutamate can cause higher values or higher sensations of anxiety, and GABA is like the counteract to that. It can lower those feelings, all right? So in fact, there's one common drug that's used for anxiety that tries to increase the levels of GABA in your bloodstream in your body. All right, so why can those get out of whack? Same issue with regard we saw with hormones. It's a very complicated production process. And any problem along this path of different steps over here can lead to imbalances in these different neurotransmitters. Okay, so we talked about the fact that in order to build these enzymes, which are little production plants to build the neurotransmitters, you have to have instructions coming from your DNA, and you actually get two different genes from your parent. You get one gene from your mother, one gene from your father that makes up a pair of genes. Then these genes are the instructions to build all these different molecules we're talking about, including transporters, receptors, and so on. Okay? And so that's also an amazing process, how God has designed all this. We have the nucleus with a chromosome, and these have just strings and strings of DNA that are strung out, and then a little section of this DNA would constitute a gene, and what the body does is once it sends a signal, part of your DNA in your nucleus unravels, it copies a segment here, sends it out to the rest of the cell to build these different neurotransmitters, all right? Now, because of genetics, it is possible that you end up with a pair of genes, both of which have a deficiency that basically builds a slow-acting enzyme. You can also have a pair of genes that can generate a fast-acting enzyme. And both of those cases can cause problems. Now, most people are born with a normal balance of their enzymes. That is, they're producing enzymes at a normal clip or a normal rate. But if you have enzymes that act too fast or enzymes that act too slow, that can create too many neurotransmitters or too few of neurotransmitters. All right. Also, there are chemicals that can actually block genes from building the enzymes that you need, and also these can lead to problems with regard to your expression of these different neurotransmitters as well. Okay, so one of the problems that people can encounter if their physiology, or they may have some genetic dispositions to issues, their body's just not producing the right amount of chemicals in their brain or in their bloodstream that is producing a normal level of anxiety, okay? So that can sometimes be a challenge. So as a result, some physicians will prescribe medications to try to get that somewhat balanced. And let me take just a few minutes to kind of explain how all of these different medications work for anxiety, okay? So again, going back to my cartoon version of a cell, this is our upstream nerve cell, this is our downstream nerve cell. The medications that have been developed in industry, there's basically 4 different strategies that they employ. One strategy has drugs that basically block the action of the enzyme that recycles and breaks down these neurotransmitters, okay? And that can lead to an overabundance of these neurotransmitters here, and so you get more dumping out into the gap. So that would be, again, a drug that's based on a hypothesis that my feelings of anxiety or also depression are due to a deficiency in the amount of neurotransmitters that I have. Another strategy that they use is to employ drugs that block this receptor gate, right? So I talked about these are being dumped into the gap and then they get recycled. Well, if you stop the recycling, you're going to get more of these building up here in the gap. And again, the hypothesis is if we increase the concentration of these different neurotransmitters like serotonin, that will lead to improved health or a decrease in anxiety or depression. Another strategy is to have a chemical that will block the receptor from being activated. All right, so there are certain chemicals that might contribute to anxiety if we have too high of values. One of those might be, for example, dopamine. So if I have a drug that blocks the effect of dopamine, again, the hypothesis is that will decrease my anxiety or decrease the overactivation of this downstream nerve cell. And then finally, a fourth strategy is to use what are called receptor enhancers. These are drugs that help open these gates at a faster rate than is accomplished by the normal concentration of neurotransmitters. So for example, a whole class of anti-anxiety drugs called benzos, like Xanax, Ativan, and so on, they act by opening more of these downstream gaps here to try to improve the GABA production in the downstream cell there, okay? So this table here provides a summary of how some of these anxiety medications work. You have different classes over here. These are benzopyrines, benzodiazepines rather, like Xanax and so on. You have beta blockers that can basically decrease adrenaline. You have antihistamines, atypical antidepressant, example would be trazodone, azopirines, Buspar, antipsychotics like lospiriton and so on. And what this little table here shows you is which particular type of neurotransmitter is being affected by these drugs and whether it's increasing the concentration or it's decreasing the concentration. So here, for example, benzos increase the concentrations of your GABA in your brain, which tends to calm people down. Here's another one, a beta blocker tends to decrease the ability of adrenaline to activate your body, so that tends to decrease anxiety as well. And here you can kind of see the different ways that these different drugs work. Now, I give you this table just so if you're taking one of these drugs or you're considering taking one, or you may have, again, a child that the doctor's talking about putting them on medication, you can kind of see what's going on here and have a basic understanding of what the drug is doing, okay? I've also given you a little table here that summarizes, again, some of these anxiety drugs. I've sent you a couple of pages of tables of these just for reference purposes. Another strategy that doctors sometimes use, or mental health professionals, is also to prescribe antidepressants to try to treat anxiety. And I won't go through this in detail, but this talks about some of the different classes of antidepressants, how they were developed, and so on. Similar to the table that I gave you for anxiety drugs, here's a list of different classes of antidepressants, and this gives you some indication of how they work and what the actual mechanics of how that happens. Now, again, most of these antidepressants, you're increasing serotonin levels, dopamine values in some cases, and adrenaline, all right? And again, these are mostly set up to handle people with depression, but some prescribers will also use these for anxiety. And I'll talk a little bit about the relevance of that here in a second. And again, here's another table that I gave you in your notes. You've got all these different types of drugs, the typical dosages. Up here, it actually kind of tells you what this drug does with regard to these different neurotransmitters, all right? It also gives you some insight into some side effects that can occur with some of these as well, okay? So the more pluses here, the stronger the response for that drug. So for example, here's disoprene, norepinephrine generates a lot of adrenaline in the body, more than most of these, okay? This column here, 5-HT is for serotonin. That's the abbreviation for that. DA is for dopamine, okay? So you can kind of see how some of those work. Now, if someone is going to be put on medications for anxiety, you need to know what you're getting into, because there's always side effects with these drugs, and there's also problems a lot of times that sometimes, it's been my experience, some mental health professionals don't really prepare people for. And let me talk about two of those issues. One is the issue of tolerance and withdrawal. So here's my abbreviated cartoon for our cell, okay, on the upstream side, looking at these transporters. So if you put somebody on a drug that blocks these, so they're not operating, your body tries to reestablish equilibrium, and what it will do is it will try to produce more of these transporters, okay? So these transporters and receptors are not fixed structures in cells. They're very dynamic. They're increasing and decreasing. So, but if you put someone on a drug that blocks these transporters, your body will produce more of these, okay? Now, when you stop taking the drug, what happens is you now have more transporters than normal, so this is going to scarf up all of the neurotransmitters in the gap, and it will basically reduce the effectiveness of the neurotransmitter. That is why you can have significant withdrawal symptoms when you get off these drugs. So you have to slowly get off them so your body can slowly basically recover back to normal over here, all right? So it hasn't produced too many of these, okay? And that gap between here and here is where people can experience withdrawal symptoms, all right? Some of those can be quite severe, all right? Another problem can happen on the downstream side, on the receptor side. Here, if I have a drug that is basically over activating the receptor, like a GABA receptor, your body again will try to rebalance things to equilibrium, and so it will get rid of some of these and diminish the amount of receptors that you have, okay? If you now then get off the drug, all right, it's going to take you a while to get back from this state to here, and again, you can experience some significant withdrawal symptoms. This is particularly a challenge for people that take those anxiety drugs like Xanax, Ativan, Valium, and so on, because to go back from getting off the drug to normal, you have to have this transition period, and a lot of times people can have some severe anxiety as they're getting off the drug. So that's just something to be aware of. When you put someone on a drug like this, there are going to be things on the downstream side, so to speak, getting off of them that you may have to deal with. So you just need to be aware of that. Another issue with regard to some of these drugs, and I'm going to focus on these benzos, which is sort of the drug that's normally prescribed for severe anxiety issues, is these drugs only stay in your bloodstream a period of time, okay? And if you look at how often you're taking the drug compared to how long it actually stays in your bloodstream, you can develop some issues where the concentrations of these drugs get higher than your normal prescribed value, okay? So for example, let me try to explain what I'm talking about here. Let's take a look at Xanax, all right? Xanax is typically prescribed 3 times a day, and it has the shortest half-life of all of these different anxiety drugs, all right? Typically 6 to 12 hours. So if we just take the average of that, 8 hours, what I'm going to simulate here on this table is taking a normal dose of 1 milligram, let's say I have a 1 milligram dose, okay. Uh, the normal dose is 3. Let's just say I start with a 1 milligram dose, and I'm taking it 3 times a day. That's why I've got these 3 different columns here. So if I take 1 milligram at beginning, in 8 hours, that dose in my bloodstream is now dropped down to 0.5, all right? And then 8 hours longer, it's going to drop down to 0.25. However, remember, I'm now taking a second dose 8 hours later, so now I've got 0.5 from the first dose, 1 from the second dose, so the effective concentration in my bloodstream is 1.5. So over several days, you can see the actual concentration in your bloodstream at any given time is building up to this sort of equilibrium, which is approximately 2 milligrams per liter. So even though I may be prescribed a dose of 1 milligram every 3 hours, the effective amount in my bloodstream builds up to like 2 milligrams per liter, okay? Why that's important is, again, when you start getting off these drugs, you're not going from 1 back to 0, you're actually going from 2 to 0, so it can take a while to actually cut the dose and let your body reestablish its equilibrium, okay? So just a few other cautions here about these medications. Everyone's body reacts differently to these medications. You should always monitor someone when they're starting on medications, as well as when they're getting off and in between as well, but particularly beginning and ending. You should never increase or decrease your dose of an anxiety drug or an antidepressant without first consulting your physician. Never add or eliminate anything else while you're on these medications, because there's always these combinations. Sometimes they can be fatal. So never take sleep medication. Generally, where you're taking one of these benzos, they can work together to basically suppress your respiratory system and in some cases cause death. And never change your diet, including supplements, again, without talking to your physician. Some supplements actually have the same effects as some of these drugs. So if you take that supplement with the drug, you can actually multiply the effects or cause some problems. And some supplements can increase or decrease the concentrations of the drug in your body. Okay. I also talked about some of these interactions. Benzos are particularly something to be careful with. Here are some typical drugs that sometimes people have. This shows how those drugs can interact with benzos to cause additional problems. So when you're taking medication, you really need to have some discussions with your medical provider to understand exactly what's going on. And if you start experiencing some side effects, know how to respond to that, okay? Now, I talked about these anxiety drugs and the antidepressants. In general, most scientists and most of the current research has concluded that the theory that depression is caused by not having enough serotonin in your brain is really not supported by the research. Similar conclusions can be drawn about anxiety drugs. Now, there are some people, when they take anxiety or antidepressant drugs, do see some improvement, but for antidepressants, it's a pretty low percentage. It's about 20%. So just be aware of that. One of the other issues you can run into with antidepressant drugs is they can also trigger anxiety. So a lot of times when someone is put on an antidepressant for anxiety, they may experience increased anxiety for several weeks to a month. Right? In fact, in some cases, a physician will actually give them another anxiety drug to counteract the anxiety that's being created by the antidepressant. So the point I'm making in this discussion today is just to know that first, there can be physical reasons why people are struggling with anxiety. They can be due to gut issues. They can be due to chronic stress issues. They can be due to hormone imbalances. And to a lesser extent, they can be due to imbalances of different neurotransmitters. That can be due to a lot of reasons themselves. It can be due to genetic issues. It can be due to nutrition issues. It can be due to physiological problems with the organs that produce those and so on. I guess the bottom line, I would say, if you are struggling with anxiety, or if you have a child that starts really having some anxiety issues, it certainly makes sense to first get them to your family physician, have a complete physical, and check your basic hormone and your levels of different critical minerals and vitamins to try to see if that might be the issue, to try to rule that out, okay? These anxiety drugs specifically, typically, from my literature, tend to kind of, I think, help people more acutely that are dealing with anxiety. These drugs here are very effective for decreasing anxiety, but they have a lot of challenges associated with them, one of which is getting off them, okay? So I wouldn't say they cause addiction, but they can certainly cause dependency issues, all right? But these definitely can help people that are struggling with anxiety. The problem is then how do you manage the issue once you've started it, okay? Or how do you get off of them? Other drugs like this can also be helpful as well. Again, antidepressants are sometimes prescribed for anxiety. I think there's certainly less clinical research to support the use of antidepressants for anxiety. At least that's my own personal opinion. Again, remember, I'm not a medical doctor or a mental health professional. I'm just sharing that based on my own personal experience with some of these medications, okay? So I've actually taken several of these different medications, including Ativan and Klonopin. Those did help my symptoms, but they caused all kinds of other challenges and issues. Certainly it was an incredible challenge to get off of those. With regard to other drugs like beta blockers, those can sometimes be helpful if a person has some high blood pressure issues to go with that. But all these drugs have some side effects with them, so that's something you need to recognize. And the question becomes, are the benefits of the drugs going to outweigh the side effects? In some cases, if you have a severe physical issue, there can certainly be some justification for that. I guess what I'm trying to kind of focus on and share with you is just to be aware of some of the complications that can come about with some of these medications, okay? And with that, I will close, and I've got, at the end of this presentation, several useful websites that kind of talk about some of the physical issues with regard to medications and so on. In lesson 2, we will look at I think some biblical guidelines for how to decide whether it's appropriate to use medications from dealing with anxiety. But today, I just wanted to try to give you a little bit of technical background on some of these medications, how they work, and some of the things to at least be aware of. Now, hopefully, if you're on one of these medications or contemplating that, I have not made you more anxious. That was certainly not my intent, but I do at least want you to be prepared. Because one of the scariest things is and this was my experience, was to be put on some of these medications, things go sideways and you're not expecting that, and then you don't know what to do, and there's really no one around to try to explain what's going on to try to kind of help you walk through that. So it's, I think, very important, again, if you have a loved one or you're on one of these medications yourself, to make sure you have a good support base before you start on a medication and when you decide to get off of one to try to help you through that process. It's also important if you know someone that is taking medications to also don't forget their support system, whether that be their spouse or a parent or something. That can also be a struggle for them trying to navigate the reactions of the person on drugs to some of the medications. So don't forget them as well. That's certainly, I think, something that we can do better of in churches is to provide people with some spiritual and emotional support if they're embarking on one of these strategies where they're actually dealing with physical challenges that have manifested themselves in anxiety, is to be aware of what's happening and to try to provide some support, not only to the person on the medication, but also the person that's providing their support base. Okay? So with that, we'll close, and then we'll see you next week to continue our discussion. Thank you very much.